Okay, thank you very much and welcome. So my name's Dave. I work at the HTA, so a trade body looking at garden industry. And what I'm going to talk to you about is the opportunities for growth in the current, really quite for a long time unprecedented environment. Now, when I signed up to give this talk, even a few months ago, the environment was looking substantially different to how it looks at the moment. And I think we'll all be aware that with pressures like costs in the supply chain, the job market, the international situation, we're in probably an unprecedentedly volatile time at the moment. So it's going to be a presentation of two halves. First of all, I'm going to go through and outline what some of those challenges are at the moment. And it will have a look at those kind of downside risks on it. So if you leave halfway through, hold on to one thing. The second half got a bit more optimistic, okay? Because the second bit, we are going to have a look at what that means for the garden industry. And it's certainly not to sugarcoat it and tell everyone and reassure everyone that it's all going to be okay. But there are some real kind of opportunities that are probably quite unique to our industry that are going to present themselves as the market gets tighter. So first up, what is going on in the current environment at the moment, and why is some of it happening, and then how might it play out? Well, one of the real kind of factors at the moment that's affecting both the kind of demand sides of the industry and also supply is that tension between inflation and average pay growth. So on the inflationary side, this chart is already wrong. It's a measure of how quickly inflation is running at. But at the moment, it's running at about 8%, just over 8% a year. The Bank of England is currently forecasting that could reach as high as 11%. And to give you an idea of just how rare that situation is in the economy, it's really been the late 80s since inflation has been running away at that sort of rate. Now, what's kind of driving that? There are international pressures on supply, on fuel. There's a general shortage of general shortage of supply for labour, which is pushing up wage bills. So there really is some very significant inflationary pressure in the economy at the moment, which is set to persist at least in the short to medium term. Set against that, of course, there is pay growth. Now, what we're looking at there is that pay growth, certainly it's kind of rebounded after the dip that you see in the pandemic there. But it's running at about 4% at the moment. Now, in ordinary times, certainly in recent times, that would be, phenomenally high pay growth, and certainly in terms of what's happening to companies' bottom lines, it is a very significant increase in there, and it's playing across all levels of roles. So there's pressure on living wage, the pressure on minimum wage, and so from a business's point of view, I'm sure we'll all be aware that really is putting pressure on margins within the business. But on the consumer side of things, what it's equating to is real-term pay cuts for our consumers. So their earnings are going less far than they were, and that's starting to change day in, day out. Now, that impact is not spread equally across all consumers. In a sense, there's no such thing as the average consumer. Where we're seeing that play out most prominently is amongst the kind of younger age groups, amongst the less socially well-advantaged age groups. And in a sense, that is the very groups who, over the course of the pandemic, have perhaps got into gardening for the first time and given it a go. So there really is a kind of challenge, in the one sense, to retain those new gardeners into the market when their pressure, the ability to drive to the garden centre is going to be more and more questioned. On the plus side, however, where we see that pressure perhaps least pronounced is amongst what you'd call the kind of core gardening demographics. So relatively kind of well-off affluent pensioners and kind of later life stage professionals. So certainly where there's a degree of security, and that certainly is a kind of plus side for the garden industry in terms of its demand. But again, back to what's happening with consumer confidence at the moment. You don't need to be an analyst to have a look at what that graph means. Essentially, consumer confidence has plummeted. The height of the pandemic, I thought I'd seen this graph go as low as it could go, and indeed, that kind of dip there under June 2020 is one of the most dramatic falls in consumer confidence that GfK, NOP, who've been tracking this since 1974, have seen. But right now, with all of the pressure on wages, all the pressure on costs, all of the uncertainty over the economy, and also the international situation as well, you have the first time in several generations a war in mainland Europe, that consumer confidence level has fallen to the lowest level that it has been tracked at since 1974. So again, some real kind of challenges there, certainly in terms of consumers making major investments in terms of kind of cars, major capital items. On the whole, those consumers are saying that now is the time to retrench, to save rather than to splash out. So we're seeing a level of caution take hold there. Now, added to that, certainly on the supply side of things, what we've seen since the pandemic is a real shortage of labour. What we're looking at here is the unemployment rate within the UK, and whilst we've seen that that's been ticking around about sort of 5%, 5 and a bit percent really for the last 6 or 7 years, even within the pandemic, with the government aid in terms of furlough, we didn't see the spike in job losses that we were afraid of probably two years ago. And indeed, since the pandemic came through, we've seen unemployment levels at a record low. In fact, for the first time in, I think certainly in a generation, the number of unfilled vacancies now exceeds across the economy the number of unemployed. So again, a kind of fundamental shift there, and some very strange things going on in terms of the economy as well. And it's again fueling that kind of wage growth. So not only are businesses struggling to source the labour that they need, but again, it's a spiral of competing for that labour that's available, which is forcing up labour cost, which of course is squeezing margins. So again, some really, really kind of unusual and challenging times there for anyone running a business. And that really does feed into what is emerging as a kind of, well, we've heard the cost of living crisis, but there's increasingly a cost of doing business crisis as well, in that one of the impacts of coming out of the European Union is we've seen a kind of, I suppose, a crunch in terms of the legislative and regulatory cycle. So a lot of regulation from government that would have been coming through on a kind of regular cycle is now being concentrated into the reasonably short window post-Brexit. And so what we've been seeing is a real kind of deluge of changes to regulations, red tape that's kind of, again, driving costs on business. So again, driving that kind of cost. Now, energy clearly is one area where costs are going up, transport, cost of raw materials for all the areas we've got. But increasingly we're looking at taxation and certainly environmental regulations that are starting to come in. Just a quick show of hands, because I'm not going to ask for volunteers, because there's one thing that the pandemic hasn't changed. It's that no one ever sits on the front rows to be picked on. Okay. So has anyone, show of hands, heard of extended producer responsibilities? Yeah, so it's a minority. It's not going to happen tomorrow, so don't kind of rush out halfway through this presentation and panic. But it is something you should be looking at. It's a reform to how packaging waste is going to be dealt with from 2024. Essentially, the more of it you provide and the less of it that's recyclable, the more businesses will have to report and pay charges, certainly over what's going through the PRN systems. So it's an example of kind of regulation that's going to be coming in and driving up cost in business. So I've painted a fairly bleak picture at the moment, but I'm fairly pleased that no one's walked out halfway through this, because the second half of this is going to have a look at, well, what does this mean for the garden industry? And we're also going to have a bit of a history lesson in terms of what we saw on the back of the credit crunch and the 2008 recession, and what it is that we can learn from that. Now, absolutely not the same. There's some very unique factors that are different now to back then, but there are some lessons that we can draw as to what happened to the garden industry then. What might that mean for us in terms of opportunity? So what we saw probably 12, 13 years ago when the last recession came through was that certain consumer trends were energised by the kind of sorts of trends that we had a look at there. And so one of the things that I'll talk about in a second is that balance between in-home and out-of-home leisure. Now this is slightly unique in that in terms of the out-of-home leisure, so the outdoor dining, the foreign holidays, etc., we've got 2 years of pent-up demand at the moment. So people haven't been able to go out, they haven't been able to go to the pub, they haven't been able to go abroad on holiday. And anyone watching the news and seeing the queues at the airports is going to see that that sort of market is struggling to keep up with demand at the moment. And for anyone who's looking at running, or is indeed running, a garden centre cafe, you'll know about the challenges of sourcing staff in there because of the competition from the hospitality industry at the moment. But certainly when there's an economic downturn, what we've tended to see is that out-of-home leisure tends to dip and in-home leisure tends to increase. So we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail. One of the things that we've also seen is value maximising as a trend, so more bargain hunting, more comparing prices, and in the very surface level, of course, you're short of money, stating the obvious, why wouldn't consumers be doing that? But certainly what we've seen in the past there is that act of value maximising takes on a social kudos, and ironically enough does take hold amongst the relatively affluent socioeconomic groups. So one of the things that we saw on the back of the last recession was a real kind of explosion in voucher seeking services. So if anyone remembers Voucher Cloud, it seemed like a miracle at the time. It was essentially an email list that kind of went through sending you discounts. But again, with technology changing, there's probably going to be some opportunities for tapping into that trend. But in terms of consumer psychology, one of the things that recessions and that uncertainty does is it stimulates a mentality of self-sufficiency, so that wanting to be in control of your environment in uncontrolled times. So given the uncertainty in the overall situation at the moment, we anticipate that consumer desire for a sense of control of their environment, a sense of control through the leisure pursuits is going to strengthen, and that holds opportunities for gardening. And again, closely related to that, what we tend to see the consumer do there is retreat to the familiar, retreat to the kind of solid, the authentic and the grounded, and that sense of stability. And again, there are opportunities for that within the garden industry, certainly compared with other sectors. So let's have a look at some of those trends in a bit more detail. So one of the things as an analyst I like is charts. And one of the things we're looking at here is some data from the Office of National Statistics, which looks at consumer spending. So for those of you like me with challenged eyesight, I'll highlight the yellow line here, which is looking at what the trends were, and these are constant prices, they're adjusted for inflation, over the years into and out of the last recession. So what we saw over here is essentially spending on that out-of-home leisure had been ticking along quite nicely, but on the back of the credit crunch crash 2008, we saw that out-of-home leisure spend really fall away. And it was quite a sustained fall. So even 5 years after that shock, that did tend to fall away quite a lot. Now, what was going on within the garden industry at that sort of time is we saw an explosion in in-home entertaining. So it was people using the garden as a place to entertain, people putting a splash of colour into the garden, people investing in garden furniture, and really, I mean, again, we ran consumer groups into this, but it was that holiday feeling in the home. So it wasn't, let's have a holiday at home, because that wasn't a feel-good thing. People were thinking, I can't go away on holiday. It was more the emotion and the sense that the garden was a place to make memories with children, with friends, that sort of thing. And that did drive opportunities for doing up the garden, making it a nice place to spend. Incidentally, within that, it's not fair to say either that all out-of-home leisure is affected equally. One of the things that's kind of going on, and I'll come on to it on a later slide, is that distinction between high-end out-of-home leisure and the occasional kind of treat and the coffee shop experience. So one of the things that will stand probably the garden centres in particular in good stead is that kind of demand for occasional treats that the garden centre cake and tea have gone, but more of that in a second. I want to have a look at value maximising, and you'd think from the consumer's point of view, how on earth is this going to be a good thing for business? One of the areas I said before that businesses 10, 15 years ago made use of here was to really up their digital engagement. So it was around loyalty points offers, it was around subscribing and putting promotional offers on services like Voucher Cloud, etc. But really the digital landscape has transformed really over the last 15 years in terms of the potential for digital marketing and persuading people in. So really through the better use of data, there are going to be opportunities through loyalty database, through analysis of where your footfall is coming, to really get inside the consumers, really to understand what is going to drive footfall, and to do some targeted advertising to local area to encourage people to go into the garden centre. So not a kind of mad rush to the bottom in terms of discounting, but some very targeted, very punchy offers, really targeted at the right consumers to get them in at the right sort of time. So with trends like Facebook advertising, where increasingly now compared to the last recession, advertising can be targeted at very tightly defined demographics linked to loyalty databases and targeted perhaps at drive times that are just on the fringe where people will be weighing up, don't I go in this weekend? There will be opportunities to drive footfall by providing that sort of sense of getting a bargain, that sense of, this journey is worth it and it's catering to my needs. So in terms of value maximising, one of the trends that we're going to have a look at here from 2012 through to now is that do I spend a lot of time looking on the internet for value and discounts and making sure it's the best offer? And what you can see there is that that pink line here on all of these is for 2012. So just about 45% of people said that they're very often using the internet to look for bargains. Now, as that kind of eroded, as that went away, as the economy recovered, we saw that went down. But it's started to creep up again in the last few years. Now, there's a couple of things going on in there. One is the general kind of economic mindset, but certainly compared with 2012, there's an increase in the number of people, certainly older demographics, who've got smartphones, who subscribe to those sorts of services. But one of the things that you'll notice within this is that even amongst the kind of core gardening age groups, for sure, it's lower in terms of that bargain hunting. So in that sense, it bears out what we were saying before. The core gardening demographic tends to be less affected by that economic downturn. But again, there's still a significant number of people there looking for those bargains who are going to be tempted in by the sense of wanting something for their money over the coming years. Example for how people are starting to tap into this already. Again, it's loyalty and fuel discounts. So when people feel that they're weighing up the value for money they're getting, they're going to want to feel more valued as a customer, more special, more rewarded, etc. And one of the things that Walmart's starting to do at the moment is explicitly linking again their loyalty database to the items that are perhaps hardest to purchase at the moment. So we all know what fuel prices are doing across the world. So again, it's really tapping into where a consumer's struggling to make ends meet and using one of the oldest marketing and loyalty database and insights tools to get that there. So again, opportunities to tempt people in on a sunny weekend by really being smart about what we understand about them from their digital records. But as the world closes in around consumers, as people feel more under challenge, as there's more bad news on the TV, as they see the kind of general malaise, one of the things that it's really, really easy but very important we don't overlook is that sort of sense for happiness. And the garden industry really does offer that in bucket loads. So that splash of colour that the bedding plants offer, that sort of sense of satisfaction of your child coming up to you to grow your own strawberries that they brought home from school and they want to plant out in the garden, is very, very it's very easy to understate just how important that is. But what we're looking at in those challenging times from gardening is something that's affordable, that's emotional connection, that is grounded, and really does bring that emotion, that joy to the kind of weekend or the life. So again, one of the things that we track with Foresight Factory is just how important is it to treat yourself. And again, we're looking at 3 points in time here, 2012, so the kind of heights of the double-dip recession. And it was running at about 60% across the piece. And this is not unique to any one particular kind of age group or socioeconomic demographic. Tough times, and it's fairly resilient. People want to be able to treat themselves within this. So again, positioning ourselves in an industry that can provide that sense of happiness, that can provide that sense of treat, that can provide that sense of joy. It should be something that helps us sort of stand out compared with competing leisure pursuits and indeed competing industries for the fairly scarce pounds in the future. Now, I talked earlier about the demographics, and you could argue that, well, is a treat always a nice to have? Is it something that you only have once you've got that kind of baseline level of economic self-sufficiency? And yeah, for sure, if you can't put food on the table, the treats, they do in terms of that hierarchy of needs, they do become a luxury. But even at the height of that double dip recession, even amongst the age groups and the socioeconomic groups that were most challenged in 2012, what we still saw was amongst those younger groups, that desire for that occasional treat, it was still strong, it was still resilient. Fell away slightly to be sure, but it's still very much there. It's just fundamental human nature that we're catering to as an industry there. Now, we talked as well at the start on this and on some of the regulatory challenges that are coming up, so extended producer responsibilities, the impacts on packaging, as well as the consumer desire to retrench that sense for the authentic, for the austere, for the non-wasteful. And one of the trends that certainly energised in the last recession, and that we're starting to see energised at the moment, is what you'd see as a war on waste. So to an extent, there's the level of social justice and responsibility within that, so not wanting to feel that we're being wasteful or that we're kind of letting stuff go that other consumers would kind of value. So we'd expect that to strengthen. But more so than perhaps 10, 15 years ago is the regulatory kind of impetus towards net zero, towards environmental impact mitigation, but also the government and consumer coming together on wanting to do more for this. Now, the temptation really is to think that the green stuff just goes away in a recession, it's just a nice to have. And I think probably in the past that has been true to an extent. But certainly what we saw through the pandemic is that kind of consumer concern, government concern for the environment, it didn't really go away, and it's still kind of ticking there at the moment. And so what we'd anticipate over the coming years as times get tough is businesses increasingly looking to their costs to take cost out of it, so looking at energy use, looking at waste packaging, avoiding those extended producer responsibilities, but also to make a benefit of this for the consumers who want to see some less waste, want to know that the goods they're consuming are good for the environment. And so probably what we expect to see is that this will bring sustainability into focus. Now, I'm going to pick on anyone, and I want you to give me one word. When I say sustainability, what do you think of? Conscious my chairman's out there as well, so I'll definitely try not to point at him. What does sustainability mean to you, sir? Okay. What does sustainability mean to you?
Sustainability?
Yep.
Means less energy consumption.
Yep.
Less waste. Also.
Yep.
Less pollution.
Yep. Absolutely. So environmental benefits. Okay. Don't worry, I wouldn't have picked on you guys. Okay. So you're right, but we talk about sustainability in three ways, people, planet and profit, and what you were saying there is absolutely right. Energy, CO2 reduction, it's got an environmental benefit, but it's also satisfying the needs of our stakeholders, our people, our communities, but also profit as well. And what we expect over the coming years is that those three things will come into focus even more than they are at the moment. So we'll see businesses making opportunities by satisfying those consumer needs, looking at the challenges on the bottom line that are going to become more pronounced, and doing the bit for the environment as well as we move towards a world of net zero. So if we were going to sum up, I'd be absolutely lying if I didn't think that for any sector of the economy there aren't some tough times coming up. But I think within the garden industry there are reasons to be optimistic, and certainly based on history, based on consumers, and based on what it is that we provide as a service, there are reasons to be optimistic and to think that we can carve out opportunities for growth within these sorts of areas. So what are those? So again, those sorts of consumer, environmental and governmental trend, they really do lend themselves to our core strengths as an industry. It's about that connection with nature, it's around contributing to the planet, it's around the affordable treats in tough time, it's around that connectedness with sense of stability, the sustainable and affordable source of joy and making moments for our communities and our families. So there are very few industries in the economy that are better set to ride out this, particularly given the fillip that those 3 million new gardeners in the pandemic gave us. Again, sustainability within that will become a key opportunity and a key focus, and that's absolutely to do with the environment, but it's also about adapting to an operating model that takes waste and cost out of the supply chain, looks at our opportunity to engage with consumers, communities and workforces to really drive growth going into this recession, if it arrives, but also into the longer term future over the next decade, where there really are some substantial opportunities for the industry and for gardening. Thank you very much for your time. Okay. A big thank you to you, sir, as well. It was very unjust of me to pick on you, but has anyone else got any questions for me, if you want me to feel awkward? Okay. It's revenge time, isn't it?
Thank you very much, yes. We are a French company, software company. We do a software which helps garden centers to digitally transform their business model. Yep. In France, particularly in Europe also, we have a large trend for garden centers going digital. Yep. Is it the same here? Does it the same trend here? Because it helps a lot what you are saying there. So what sort of trend do you see in UK?
Yeah, very much the case, and I think on two levels. One is on the operational, and one is on the consumer. So on the consumer side of things, what we're seeing is more use of the kind of marketing and segmentation tools that are coming through Facebook, Google Ads, Instagram, etc. And that's really about getting under the skin of your consumer, understanding exactly what are the differences between different types of consumer, and being able to kind of target them where they are, when they are. So again, if it's sunny, if you have people within a certain area, it's about being able to do that real micro-targeting about the offers and relevance to them, rather than just perhaps where we were 10, 15 years ago is we'll do a door drop, we'll plan it months in advance. So there's a lot more agility and a lot more talking to the consumers about their needs and really tailoring it. I think on the operational side of things, we're seeing better use of data to streamline supply chains, so to take inefficiency out of the business, and to get better planning data as well. So having a look at those sorts of sales trends, what's going strong, what's not, and to look at that as a business improvement tool, but also to take kind of cost and I suppose admin out of the supply chain. So that could be as mundane as the person who 10, 15 years ago was sort of typing in the kind of stock list into the EPOS system versus now seamlessly transferring them through. So it's transformational, it's accelerating, and it goes right throughout the business, really. Yep. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, in which case, thanks very much for your time.